So first of all, let's just start with, this is the brain. Okay, this is the brain. The whole thing's the brain. There's there's parts of it though. There's the brain stem, and the brain stem, and I got to tell you, there's some disagreement about this. Some people put the midbrain on the brain stem. Your book does, and some people don't consider the midbrain part of the brain stem. I don't really care, but there's a brain stem, which is definitely the medulla oblongata, the pons, and some people say the midbrain up in here. So the brain stem, medulla oblongata, pons, and midbrain. I'll point to them again when I open this brain up. And then there's a midbrain in here with the cerebral peduncles and corpora quadrigemina. I'll get to them. You have the cerebellum here and here. And then you have the lobes of the cerebral cortex. Frontal lobe, parietal lobe, frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital. And then we open it up, we look at some of the insides of the brain. So let's get started. Let's open this up like this. And now you're looking at half of the brain, one hemisphere. All right. The brain stem, according to your list, doesn't include this midbrain. It's the medulla oblongata, the pons, and this swollen area on each side of the medulla oblongata, right here, called the olives. That's the olives. That's the olives. It's a swollen area on each side of the medulla oblongata. So there's the olives. There's an olivary nucleus inside there, which is a relay station for motor commands. Olives, medulla, pons. All right. Oh, the pyramids. Right here, this bump in the very center on the front is what we call the decussation of the pyramids. The pyramids are descending motor tracks, first of all. If you haven't listened to the lecture yet, pyramids are descending motor tracks. And they decussate or cross over right here and here. Decussation of the pyramids here and here. That's why it's bumped right there, because my fibers are coming down through and crossing over and crossing over. All right? It says 39 on your sheet for the pyramids. Oh yeah, there's 39 right there. Now, it won't be 39 in every single brain. There's 2 types of brains in this lab, or even 3 types of brains. These numbers that you have are only one of the types of brains, not all of them. All right, so that's the brain stem. Now, the midbrain is a couple things here. Let me get this on the video. What I'm doing here is this. You have half of this brain, it comes off like this. Half and half, it comes off. I'm about to take this apart for you. Let me put it back together for now. The midbrain are these cerebral peduncles way down deep in here. Cerebral peduncles. And on the back of the midbrain, the superior colliculi and inferior colliculi here and here. The 4 of them together, the superior colliculi in this half of the brain, and the superior colliculi in this half of the brain, and the inferior colliculi in this half of the brain, and the inferior colliculi in that half of the brain, the 4 of those together, because they come together. They come together. They fit together just like this. The 4 of them together are called the corpora quadrigemina. Corpora meaning body, quad meaning 4 bodies. Corpora quadrigemina. So the midbrain are these cerebral peduncles and these corpora quadrigemina. Now, let's look at the midbrain. First of all, you have to know the cerebral peduncles, these vertical fibers running up and down from the pons up to the diencephalon. And I haven't even named the diencephalon yet, but I will. So these vertical fibers right here, running up and down between the pons and the diencephalon. Cerebral peduncles. Be very, very careful. These are cerebellar peduncles. The cerebellar peduncles run to the cerebellum. The cerebral peduncles run to the cerebrum. So be very careful that you call these cerebral peduncles and you call these later cerebellar peduncles. The midbrain also has the corpora quadrigemina, these 4 bodies right here. 2 superior colliculi here and here. 2 inferior colliculi here and here. The superior colliculi do visual reflexes, and the inferior colliculi do auditory reflexes. The cerebral peduncle is just a relay station. All right. just to go back and tell you the function of the medulla does heart rate, blood pressure, and respiration. Heart rate, blood pressure, and respiration. What does the pons do? The pons is mainly a relay station, but it also has respiratory centers in it. The pons and the medulla talk to set up your breathing rhythm. All right. Now, next, cerebellum. Here's your cerebellum right here and here. Just like that. Cerebellum. There's two hemispheres to the cerebellum. In the center of my cerebellum right here, I have a vermis. That's called a vermis right here. So the vermis is the center of my cerebellum. Hemisphere, hemisphere, vermis right in the center. Cerebellar peduncles. If I take this cerebellum off, how does this cerebellum talk to the rest of the brain? Happens this brain has magnets on it. So my cerebellar peduncles are actually these magnetized areas. Right there with the magnet and right there with the magnet. These are my cerebellar peduncles. You don't have to know superior, middle, and inferior, do you? Oh, you do. Okay, if you look at my cerebellar peduncles, you'll see these letters F, H, F, G, and H. Right here, F. I'll turn it like this so you can see it. F, G, and H. This is saying that this is the superior cerebellar peduncle. G is the middle cerebellar peduncle. And H, which kind of looks like a B almost. And H, I'm assuming it's an H. And H, which is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. All three of these areas connect the pons to the cerebellum, and it has the magnet right in the center of it. So you can put that right back on there, and it's magnetized. So those are cerebellar peduncles. F, G, and H. Superior, middle, and inferior. All right? Arborvitae. That's the white tree-looking part of the cerebellum. It's the white matter. Arborvitae. Tree of life. So that white stuff is the arborvitae. What does the cerebellum do? It's for muscular coordination. They call it the comparator function. And why they call it the comparator function is because it compares what you plan to do with what you are actually doing. When you get ready to jump up and walk to the fridge and grab a beer, you have a plan in your head how to do that. And then when you start to execute that plan and the dog runs in front of you, your plan is kind of screwed up and you start to fall. The cerebellum keeps you from falling because it compares your plan with the execution, and it keeps you in balance, in other words. All right, arborvitae. Vermis. I already did the vermis. The vermis, let me put this back together. The vermis is the centerpiece of the cerebellum. Let me tell you about cerebellar neurons. They have around 200 to 250,000 synapses per cell. Per cell. 250,000 synapses per cell. A normal nerve in your cerebral cortex has 1/100th to 1/10 of that. So a neuron in your cerebral cortex has about 2,500 to 25,000 synapses per cell, whereas the neurons in your cerebellum have 250,000. All right. Diencephalon. Okay, let me put the brain back together briefly, just so you can see what you're dealing with here. See the brain on the video? Mm-hmm. Okay, now let's take this apart like this. The diencephalon is several structures here. One is it's the thalamus, which I'm circling right here. 26 and 22 there are both parts of the thalamus. The other is the hypothalamus right here. And lastly, it's the epithalamus right there. Number 23 is the epithalamus. And the habenula, that white area right there. So the diencephalon is epithalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus. That's the diencephalon. All right? Now, I'll leave this over here so I can point on both hemispheres. Let's go through the diencephalon. First of all, this thalamus. This is how I recognize it. The thalamus always has that spot in the middle. That spot right there. Sam, can you pass me the other brain right next to you? That spot in other brains is sometimes brownish, and I'm going to show you. There's that same spot right there. That spot is called the interthalamic adhesion. That spot here and that spot there is the same spot. The thalamus is actually two lobes. And that spot connects the two lobes. It's called the interthalamic adhesion. So it's connecting the right and left thalamus, right there and right there. So that's called the interthalamic adhesion. That's part of the thalamic lobes, and everything around it's the thalamus. So on this brain, the interthalamic adhesion is 22 and the thalamus is 26. Now below the thalamus right here is the hypothalamus, this whole area right here. And on this side, I want to show you something. Over here, there's the spot, the interthalamic adhesion. There's the thalamus. Below the thalamus is this hypothalamus. Hanging off the hypothalamus is this pituitary gland via this stalk called the infundibulum. So the pituitary gland hangs off your hypothalamus. So thalamus, interthalamic adhesion, hypothalamus, infundibulum, pituitary, and then the epithalamus, not seen on this half of the brain, by the way, not seen on this half of the brain. So let's go back over here. The epithalamus is this number 23 right here. It's behind the corpora quadrigemina. It's behind the corpora quadrigemina. On this model, it looks slightly different. On this model, the epithalamus is that white dot right there. Right there. Now, what you're going to say is you're going to see that this is the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi of the corpora quadrigemina here and here. And I just told you that white dot is the part of the epithalamus. It's actually called the pineal gland, by the way. That white dot is called the pineal gland. That white dot is called the pineal gland. The pineal gland is not on here. You're going to say to me, well, what's that structure? That's the posterior commissure. So I got corpora quadrigemina, superior colliculi, inferior colliculi of the corpora quadrigemina. I have the posterior commissure. I have the pineal gland of the epithalamus. Right here, I have the habenula, but it doesn't have a specific color to it. Whereas over here, I have my pineal gland, and here's my habenula is white. So that's a habenula right there. And the pineal gland and the habenula are my epithalamus. Pineal gland and habenula are my epithalamus. The pineal gland secretes melatonin, which gives you your circadian rhythms. And it also, we think melatonin causes pubescent boys and girls to enter puberty. Sexual maturation, in other words. So melatonin comes from the pineal gland. It's involved in your sleep-wake cycles. The habenula is involved in emotions linked to olfaction. So when you walk into your grandmother's house and she's cooking meatloaf and it brings back these nice emotions and nostalgia, and you think back to the days, and that's all occurring in your habenula right there. What's that? What's funny?
Back in the day when you were eating meatloaf.
Or whatever odor brings back those old days. All right, thalamus, interthalamic, epithalamus, hypothalamus, we did. The mammillary bodies. Let me put this back together. If I put this back together, you got to be careful here, because this one, be careful of these pituitary glands. They're not supposed to come out, but some of them do. Okay. I wish I could. Oh, I can bend it a little bit. I've just bent the pituitary gland out of the way. I'm pointing in here to the pons and the cerebral peduncles. Pons and cerebral peduncles. This is called the optic chiasma. We're not there yet. That's where the two optic nerves cross. The mammillary bodies are right here. Here and here. Right here and there. On this model, here's one, and this model, you guys are going to want me to ask you mammillary bodies on this model. Look how big they are. The mammillary bodies here, let me get that pituitary out of the way. Well, here's one of them. There's one of them right there. Let me move that pituitary. There's the other one right there. Mammillary body, mammillary body. Mammillary body right there, mammillary body right there. Some other class must have labeled this up. So that's mammillary bodies. Mammillary bodies are involved in eating reflexes. Mammillary bodies are involved in your reflexes due to your sense of smell, olfactory reflexes. All right, mammillary or eating reflexes and olfactory reflexes. That's your mammillary body. The infundibulum we already did. It's this stalk that the pituitary gland hangs off of. Here's that stalk right there. And there's the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is your master endocrine organ. The infundibulin just connects the pituitary to the hypothalamus. All right, cerebrum. All of this out here is the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is more than just the cerebral cortex. There's also some white matter. The cerebral cortex is gray matter. There is some white matter called the internal capsule that's part of your cerebrum. So there is that going on too. But all of this is your cerebrum. Your cerebrum has lobes. First of all, this outside of your cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex. Humans have 6 layers to it. No other mammal has 6 layers to it. No other organism has 6 layers to the cerebral cortex. It's one of the things that makes us human. All 6 layers. All right. The cerebral medulla is the white matter underneath the gray matter. And none of the models I have show it. So I'm going to have to come back to the white matter. All right. I'm going to have to come back to the cerebral medulla. I will come back to it. Can you take that brain out and open it up, and I'll see if it has cerebral medulla. I know some of these models have it, so I'm not crossing it off. Lobes. Let's do the lobes. The first thing you should do when you grab a brain is find this major... Well, let me just back up. The bumps are called gyri, and the valleys are called sulci. So the bumps are called gyri. The valleys are called sulci. There's this major sulcus coming across the top of my brain like this. It's called the central sulcus. And some of these brains, people have put their pen in there and gone like what I'm doing here with my stick. And you'll see the ink in there. That's called the central sulcus. All right. In front of the central sulcus, all of this is the frontal lobe. That's the frontal lobe. Behind the central sulcus, back here, is called the parietal lobe, both sides, right and left parietal lobe. Down here on the sides is called the temporal lobe, and in the back is called the occipital lobe.
Where's the cutoff for the occipital? Okay,
the occipital lobe parietal cutoff is not as distinct, so I'll put the sticker on the very back, and I'll put the sticker right up here for parietal, because it's not as distinct a cutoff between parietal and occipital, parietal and occipital. So I'll make it distinct by removing the stickers from each other, putting them a long distance apart. All right. The frontal lobe does motor planning, and it's the seat of your intellect, probably. Well, it is, not probably. It is. It's where you have intellect, where you're smart. The very tippy front of my frontal lobe, called the prefrontal cortex, is where you can predict possible future outcomes. It's why you know that if you step out in front of a bus, it's going to hurt. It's your prefrontal cortex. But remember, that also leads to anxiety. So all your anxiety originates in your prefrontal cortex. What anxiety is predicting possible future outcomes. Why are you anxious right now? None of them have happened yet. Because you're predicting that they may happen, and you're anxious about it. So prefrontal cortex, anxiety, and intellect, motivation. This part of your frontal lobe is called the premotor area. That's where you plan your motor units. You know, when you're going to jump over a candlestick, you put the whole plan together before you contract one muscle. The entire plan is in your brain before you contract a muscle. So your premotor area here does the plan. And then it sends the plan to this area right here. Very important area. It's going to be on your lab exam and on your lecture exam. This area right here is called your precentral gyrus. It's the gyrus right in front of your central sulcus. So because it's the gyrus in front of your central sulcus, it's called the precentral gyrus. It's your primary motor area. That's where you execute your plan. So the plan was here, and then you sent the signal to your precentral gyrus, which fired the proper neurons at the proper time to contract the proper muscles to execute the plan. Your precentral gyrus is your primary motor area. So that's your frontal lobe in a nutshell. Your parietal lobe right here. Your parietal lobe contains this very special gyrus right here called the postcentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus is your primary somatosensory area. Somatosenses, not special senses. That means your tactile, pressure, body position, those senses from your body, not your head. You know, eyesight, smell, taste, hearing, that's all special senses. The rest of your senses are called somatosenses, and they go to here. They go to your postcentral gyrus. So this is the parietal lobe. Temporal lobe right here. This is the temporal lobe. What separates the frontal and parietal from the temporal is this lateral fissure right here. This is the lateral fissure. All right? It separates the frontal and the parietal from the temporal. So that's the lateral fissure. That's the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe does hearing for us. Hearing. All right? Now, if I were to stick my finger deep into this lateral fissure, I would hit what we call the fifth lobe, or the insula. Now, let me show you how this model depicts the insula. If I were to stick this stick through this lateral fissure, right like that, right like that, okay, just like that, I should be hitting the insula. Now, watch what happens when I take this apart. I'm hitting the insula. So how this model shows the insula is this right here. That's the insula, right there. All right?
Can you put it back in?
Yep, I'll put it back in and show you again. Okay, so you see the insula?
Mm-hmm.
Now watch. And if I were to stick my stick in the lateral fissure, I'd hit the insula. That insula right there. All right? The insula does gustation. You're going to say, what the heck's gustation? Taste. The insula does taste. A little bit of the insula does olfaction or smell. But part of smell is also part of the temporal lobe. And to be honest, part of the smell is in the frontal lobe. In the lecture that I did for you guys, I pointed to all three areas, the temporal lobe, the insula, and the frontal lobe. And I said, smell is right there. And we used to call it the rhinencephalon. Rhino nose, rhinencephalon. And humans have a small rhinencephalon. That's why we don't have a great sense of smell. But some animals, like bears and hound dogs, they have a huge rhinencephalon, and that's why they can smell you a mile away. So the rhinencephalon for the humans is pretty small. The occipital lobe back here does vision. I know your eyes receive the light, and they transduce the light to electrical signals, but you actually see back here. If you hit someone in the back of the head, you could make them go blind, because you could damage their visual cortex, they call it. It's in the occipital lobe. Any questions about those lobes? You got all that in the video?
Yes.
Okay.